Imagine for a moment a body of water so shallow you could nearly stand in the center of it and keep your head above the surface. This was Lake Peigneur, a 3.5 billion gallon freshwater sanctuary in southern Louisiana. To the locals in 1980, it was a place of peace, a 10-foot deep mirror reflecting the ancient live oaks of Jefferson Island. But beneath that mirror lay a secret, a crystalline labyrinth of salt caverns stretching thousands of feet into the dark. On November 20th, a single mathematical ghost, a mistake hidden in the ink of a map, would pull the plug on this entire world, triggering a cataclysm so surreal it remains one of the most haunting industrial disasters in history. The morning began in the gray, humid light of a Louisiana autumn. On the surface of the lake, the 12-man crew of Wilson Brothers Rig 20, contracted by Texaco, was looking for oil. They were positioned at the edge of the Jefferson Island Salt Dome, a massive subterranean pillar of salt that pushed the land upward like a slow-motion eruption. For nearly 60 years, the Diamond Crystal Salt Company had been carving this dome from the inside out, creating a cathedral of salt, caverns as wide as 4-lane highways and 80 feet high. The miners below and the drillers above were separated by over 1,000 feet of solid rock and salt, a distance that felt like an eternity, but they were closer than anyone realized. The disaster didn't begin with a bang. It began with a seizure. At 4:30 a.m., as the 14-inch drill bit ground its way through the earth, it suddenly stuck. The crew felt the shudder through the platform. They were at a depth of 1,228 feet. They tried to work it loose, a routine maneuver, but the earth wouldn't let go. Then came the sounds, the sharp metallic cracks of steel under pressure, and a series of loud, ominous pops that echoed across the quiet water. Slowly, the 150-foot tall oil derrick began to tilt. It was subtle at first, 2 feet, then 3. The crew didn't wait for a fourth. They cut the barges loose and scrambled into lifeboats, rowing for their lives toward a shore that suddenly felt too far away. From the bank, they watched in stunned silence as their $5 million platform, a structure as tall as a 15-story building, tilted, groaned, and then simply vanished vertically into a lake that was only 10 feet deep. What they didn't know was that miles below their feet, the nightmare had already started. 1,300 feet down, in the cold, white heart of the salt mine, electrician Junius Gaddison was checking wire supplies. In the absolute silence of the mine, sound carries like a physical weight. He heard a strange, rhythmic banging coming from the darkness of a corridor. When he turned his flashlight toward the sound, he didn't see a cave-in. He saw the impossible, a muddy stream of water, and 2 feet deep and rising was racing toward him, carrying empty fuel drums that were slamming against the salt walls. Gaddison didn't hesitate. He hit the emergency alarm, a series of lights that flashed 3 times throughout the miles of tunnels. 55 miners were scattered throughout the levels, some as deep as 1,500 feet. In the dark, the sound of the water was a low, guttural roar. They knew the physics of their world better than anyone. Salt is strong until it meets fresh water. The moment the lake touched the salt pillars, they began to dissolve. The very structures holding up the ceiling were melting. A frantic, desperate race for the surface began. The miners moved through the tunnels, some using mine carts and diesel vehicles, others running through rising sludge. Their only exit was a single service elevator that could carry only 8 men at a time. Among them was Randy LaSalle. While others headed for the elevator, LaSalle climbed into a truck. He knew there were men in the remote reaches of the 1,500-foot level who might not have seen the lights. In a display of chilling bravery, he drove into the deepening gloom, searching the furthest corridors to ensure no one was left behind. At the elevator station, the tension was suffocating. The miners stood in line, listening to the roar of the water and the groaning of the collapsing salt pillars, waiting for the slow, agonizing ascent of the lift. 8 men at a time, 8 more. The water was no longer a stream. It was a torrent. Back on the surface, Lake Peigneur was transforming into a maelstrom. The 14-inch puncture had become a gaping throat. As the fresh water scoured the salt, the hole grew exponentially, wide from inches to hundreds of feet in a matter of hours. A whirlpool formed, a quarter-mile wide, spinning with such ferocity that it began to swallow everything in its reach. 11 barges, many loaded with rock salt and trucks, were dragged into the vortex like toys in a bathtub. A tugboat captain fought his engines, desperate to pull his vessel away, but the current was too strong. He and his crew were forced to leap into the mud as their boat was sucked into the abyss. Leonce Viator Jr., a local fisherman out with his nephew, found himself in the middle of a dying lake. The water drained so fast that his boat was grounded in the mud within minutes. They scrambled out and tied the boat to a tree on the shoreline, all thinking they were safe. They turned back just in time to see the shoreline itself begin to liquefy. The tree, the boat, and 65 acres of the surrounding Jefferson Island slid into the crater. Greenhouses, a barge loading dock, and the lush botanical wonders of live oak gardens were consumed by the earth. But the most terrifying moment was yet to come. As the lake level plummeted, it dropped below the level of the Gulf of Mexico. The Del Cambre Canal, which normally flowed out of the lake, suddenly stopped. It shivered and then it reversed. For the first and only time in recorded history, the Gulf of Mexico flowed into the heart of the American continent. This backflow created a 164-foot waterfall, the tallest ever seen in Louisiana, tumbling into the empty, muddy crater where the lake had been. The air inside the mine had nowhere to go. As billions of gallons of water displaced the oxygen, it compressed with such force that it erupted out of the mine shafts like a cannon. Geysers of mud and pressurized air shot 400 feet into the sky. Then, a natural gas line at the center of the crater ruptured. A column of fire erupted from the water, a pillar of flame so high that the FAA had to reroute air traffic for fear of an explosion. It looked like the end of the world. By the time the sun set on November 20th, Lake Peigneur was gone. In its place was a smoking, a muddy basin filled with the wreckage of an industrial empire. But as the days passed, a miracle emerged from the chaos. Despite the collapse of an entire mine and the disappearance of a lake, not a single human life was lost. All 55 miners had reached the surface, the last of them stepping off the elevator just as the mine fully inundated. Even the crew of the rig had made it to the bank in time. The only casualties were 3 dogs and the lake's very identity. When the water finally equalized, the lake returned, but it was a stranger. What was once a 10-foot deep freshwater pond was now a 200-foot deep saltwater basin. 9 of the 11 sunken barges eventually popped back to the surface like corks, but the drilling rig and the tugboat remained buried forever in the salt. Today, if you visit the shores of the lake, you can still see a single brick chimney standing out of the water, the only remains of a house that was dragged into the depths. The disaster was eventually traced back to a simple human error, a coordinate system mismatch. One team used the universal transverse Mercator system, while the other used a localized transverse Mercator projection. A few hundred feet of math on a piece of paper was the difference between a successful well and a cataclysm. It serves as a chilling reminder of how fragile our world is and how quickly the landscape we trust can collapse beneath us when we forget to double-check the math. Lake Peigneur remains deep, salty, and silent, a permanent scar on the Louisiana coast, marking the day the earth opened its mouth and swallowed a lake whole.